In March, Israeli jets hit an Iranian naval port on the Caspian, and 4 months later, a Ukrainian drone struck ships in those exact same waters, 600 miles away from Ukraine's front line, in a sea that Ukraine doesn't even border. Well, the easy headline here is just the wars are spilling into each other. And sure, mechanically that is the case, but it actually misses what's happening. What we are looking at is two completely different conflicts, one in the Middle East and one in Eastern Europe, converging on the exact same target, which is an underground cross-continental infrastructure network that the West's own sanctions helped to create. I know how that sounds, but stay with me. For years, the foundational Western playbook against both Russia and Iran has been the same: sanctions. The intention was always to cut both nations out of the financial transactions, to choke the money as well as the tech and the trade that passed through both of them until they could no longer function. The isolation was to be used as a weapon. But here is the contradiction that we have to look at. If the strategy was the total isolation of both nations, why is it that now Iran and Russia are more entangled than at any other point in modern history? They're both co-producing weapons, sharing intelligence, and running a massive sanctions evasion corridor that passes straight through the Caspian Sea. This is not how isolation is supposed to look like. And that is a system that is currently being built out of necessity by both Iran and Russia. It will be naive to think that Iran and Russia are anything but friends of convenience. Russia and Iran have centuries of strategic distrust. They undercut each other on oil markets, fighting for the same buyers, as well as clash over the strategic influence in the Caucasus. Interestingly, Russia still won't sell Iran its top-tier fighter jets, and behind the closed doors, Moscow is actively trying to cut Tehran out of the drone manufacturing loop it has learned from Tehran firsthand. So, is this relationship fragile? Yes, but it was never really the point, because sanctions did not make them friends, but instead they forced them to build the architecture to bypass the Western restrictions. And architecture doesn't need the trust to function, but simply a mutual benefit. Let me show you how that system works. First and above all, let's start with the corridor. There is a trade route called the International North-South Transport Corridor, and it's the spine of the whole thing. A 7,200 kilometer wide network of rail, road and shipping that runs from Russia down through the Caspian and Iran, all the way to the Persian Gulf and India. And it completely bypasses the Suez Canal and every sea lane the West controls. Interestingly, the corridor was formally launched in year 2000, but it just sat there dormant for 2 decades because it didn't receive sufficient investments. It was only in 2022, when Western nations hit Russia with sanctions, that Moscow developed every reason to invest into the corridor. So, the Western sanctions didn't kill that corridor, but on the contrary, they brought it back to life. The trade route is the backbone of everything. Now, if we stack on top of it the weapons trade happening on it, we can watch how sanctions show up at every single step. When Russia's invasion of Ukraine initially stalled in 2022, it realized it needed cheap drones fast in order to overwhelm Ukrainian defense forces. It couldn't just buy them from the open market due to the sanctions. It had only one option left. It was to ask Iran. And Iran didn't wait long when it handed over Shahed 136. But Russia didn't want to just stop at importing the Shaheds. Instead, it wanted to start assembling them locally. So in December 2022, it signed a deal with Iran to build them itself at a plant called Alabuga in Tatarstan, around 600 miles east of Moscow. Iran started shipping the deassembled drones and the blueprints, and Russia stood up its own production line and renamed the drones into locally produced Jiran-2s. The drone factory in Alabuga sits on a river that runs straight into the Caspian, so the drone plant is actually part of the corridor. After something telling happened, Russia got so good at manufacturing the drones that they actually reversed the pipeline. Once the Gulf War broke out, Russia started sending its hardened, battle-tested upgrades back to Iran. And now Moscow is quietly trying to edge Tehran out of the global drone export market entirely. The dependence of both nations on each other is not only limited to weapons. Ukraine's President Zelensky stated that Russia has been feeding Iran targeting intelligence and helped Iran aim its drones at American bases across the Gulf. So the system moves in weapons and intelligence in both directions. Then you have to look at the money. The West's ultimate weapon was kicking them out of the global financial system. So both nations instead hardwired their own systems together. Russia took its own domestic financial messaging system called the SPFC and linked it directly into Iran's equivalent, SEPAM. Now they settle deals in local currencies, in rubles and rials, without a single byte of data touching the Western server. And in order to move the oil, they're running ghost fleets of dark tankers right across the Caspian Sea, because it's closed sea with no NATO ships, so Russian tankers can just turn off their satellite transporters, sail south completely off the radar, and drop their sanctioned crude oil at Iran's northern Neka terminal. Iran pumps that Russian oil into its northern refineries, and in exchange it ships an equivalent amount of Iranian oil out of the Persian Gulf to Russia's buyers in Asia. None of this requires Moscow and Tehran to trust each other. They purposefully built every single one of these pipes in a geographic and economic blind spot where Western sanctions simply cannot reach. So, if you are the West, you're out of levers. You cannot sanction a trade route that doesn't use your money, and you can't freeze a ghost fleet sailing in a sea you don't control. Let's look again at those two strikes, because now you can see exactly why they happened. Israel didn't pick Bandar Azaril port at random. It's the Iranian gateway of the corridor and Iran's window to Russia. Bomb it and you're not hitting a navy, but you're hitting the system's front door. Ukraine likewise hit what moved through that front door. It said that the cargo ship that it struck was carrying the military weapons from Iran to Russia. So it was a direct signal that the trade could no longer continue. Both strikes happened to disrupt the sanctions evasion system Tehran and Moscow have built. So here's the real lesson of the sea. Sanctions come with a cost that nobody prints on the label. If you cut off one country, you can punish it. But if you cut off enough of the powerful pariah states, you don't isolate anyone. Instead, you hand them a reason to build their own alternative system. The most important person watching this dynamic unfold isn't in Moscow or in Tehran. It is in Beijing. Xi Jinping has been eyeing out Taiwan for quite a while now, and the lessons that it learns from Russia and Iran building of alternative systems is actually going to be helpful should it choose to impose a military blockade of Taiwan and intervene militarily. Because from this very blueprint, it can learn how can great powers survive sanctions and actually start building a system of their own. The Caspian Sea was supposed to be a forgotten corner of the map. Instead, it's where we found out what sanctions can facilitate building and who is behind studying the blueprint.